Okay, so Victor Raymond, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate your time. Um, shall we begin with saying something about who you are and your background and how it is that you came to write a chapter in the book behind me with Gary Allen Fine, one of the legends of research in role-playing games, who we all bow down to because he knew things 40 years ago that we're still discovering now.
Yes, this is interesting. I have two paths on how I got here. One of them was that I was a teenager living in the Twin Cities in the 1970s in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and was deeply interested in gaming and the science fiction and fantasy. And so um, got to know through friends in high school about this thing called D&D, and I was not there at the very beginning. I try to remind people about that. I discovered D&D in 1975, and I started playing at that time. And relatively quickly, I ended up meeting various people who were around at the beginning, not the least of whom was Michael Bernard, who Michael was a recent transfer to the University of Minnesota. Actually, not transfer. He got there uh, as a freshman, as a first year university student, um, in fall of 1973. And yeah, from there, things progressed. I mean, Michael was not by any means the only one. I eventually got to know Dave Arneson, albeit somewhat distantly. Later on, we became closer friends. But my father was a faculty member at the University of Minnesota, and I had grown up with a household full of books about social sciences, anthropology, sociology, and so on. And so when I went to university, I went to Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and got a bachelor's degree and did an honors thesis on role playing when I was a university student. And then I went on to get a doctorate in sociology from Iowa State University much later. That came much later. But out of that, I renewed my acquaintance with Gary Fine. I had met Gary when he was doing his ethnography, and I participated in the ethnography that became shared fantasy. Um, and yeah, so as a result, I had both a personal and an academic interest, which led to the chapter that Gary and I wrote. So
That's very, very cool. So in the chapter that you wrote, you talk about a couple of things which not everyone will know about because they have specific definitions in sociology and beyond. So one of them being deviance, um,
mhm.
and the other one being soft communities.
Yeah,
And the thing I'm very interested in is deviance because one of my theses is potentially the possibility that TTRPGs are laboratories for less than positive behavior, or behavior that you wouldn't necessarily get involved in outside of the game. And that seems to have been borne out a bit by Gary Allen Fine's work. And then your chapter comes along and says something quite similar, but also couches it in this idea of it depends on the people who are there. Is that fair? So, would you mind saying something about deviance and soft communities as you see it?
sure. To my mind, Gary's theory, his concept of a soft community represents um, what might be expressed as the weak ties that are expressed by members within a club or uh, in a group, an informal group that meets, and usually, for some specific purpose. In this case, gaming, right? And so the norms that are established by that group form the basis for, but not always, strict, what we might call strictly enforced. We don't, formal enforcement of these things is sometimes difficult. I mean, you usually find it in things like, for example, milestones such as people being formally accepted as members of a group, or if they are formally expelled from a group. Okay. But within the rest of it, an awful lot of time, it really depends on the people who are recognized being within the group, expressing their feelings and reactions to each other's behavior to one another. That forms the basis of what Gary would call the soft community. Okay. Does that give you some sense of that?
Yes.
Then as far as deviance is concerned, the insight that I had with that was that uh, when you are playing a character, when you are role playing, there is the supposition from the beginning that what you are doing is not you. Okay. Now, this is where psychology, I think, would have some interesting insights because uh, there's the sense of, well, yeah, it's not you, but it still is you, right? There is, in fact, role playing over the past 50 years has innumerable stories about people who are, playing themselves, but just under, a different name. And I'm not really so much interested in that per se, the gradations of that between self association or self I would say abnegation or in some form of setting one's personal identity aside. But but it is the supposition within the game that you're not playing yourself. You're playing this character. Okay. And in so doing, that gives you an excuse, as it were, to do things that you might not otherwise do if you were you. Okay. So sometimes, for example, perhaps an introverted person might play someone who is, more outgoing. They may not necessarily know how to do that well, but they might try, and vice versa. Okay. But when deviance comes in, it's, well, let's face it, one of the things about the games, from Dungeons and Dragons from the beginning is the expected behavior of the characters is not anything that we as players would do in the real world, right? The whole idea of let's kill things and take their stuff doesn't show up on the, it's like, on the list of accepted behaviors, but we get to imagine it, right? And in fact, most stories that you run across related to D&D have this element to them. We get to do things we wouldn't do in the real world. Okay, great. But that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences, and it doesn't mean that there aren't norms to be observed, right? And so, my thought in all of this was that it allowed players to engage in the player sense in a form of vicarious deviance. Okay. And so that was, well, I wouldn't do this myself, but my character can do it, and we'll see what happens, right? And sometimes that has reactions from the other players and the people in the group. It's like that was really cool, or wow, why did you do that? You know that the frame of gameplay that you have a small group of people that are getting together and they're going to act with one another, and there's 50 years of stories being told about how the group worked together and did everything really cool, and also stories about there was this one guy in the group who never got what we were trying to do, and he was always causing trouble, or you know things of that sort. And to me, that's evidence of the extent to which within the player frame the deviance is both in game and also at the table. Okay, which is something we didn't really get into in that chapter. Okay. That in fact, one very big aspect of this is that uh, these things coexist. what Goffman would have referred to as frames simultaneously interacting with one another, which makes it hard because it means is someone reacting to me because of how I'm playing my character, or are they reacting to me because of how I'm acting, right? That is to say, me as the person, not me, the character. You know, uh, we're getting very close to George Herbert Mead territory at this point. The I and the me, but that's sociology. We'll leave that to the side for the moment. But what that does suggest, though, is that the game, because it's about these characters and also about the players at the same time, the game acts as a form of mediated socialization. You know, that you learn how to play. You both learn how to play with, okay, here's Fred and Mary and John, who are the other people in the group. Uh, but you also get to learn how to play with their characters. And so there's these two frames, at least, that we could look at in terms of how uh, people understand their expected behavior and their deviance, right? So, in that sense, a successful play of the game involves the players understanding and reacting positively to one another, but their characters may be doing different things, right? Okay. But in all of this, every player at any given time is reacting to the play of other people's characters and their own play of their own character. Uh, I don't know if I'm getting too specific here, but I hope this is making some sense.
I love it. I already have a. Can I ask a potentially massive question straight off the bat?
Sure.
Deviance suggests more negative than standard, at least to the common
Um,
man, right? To the lay person. Is
right.
that's what you're talking about here as well?
No, let's get to the chase of this. There's a couple of different things going on. I'm using deviance in the sociological sense, which is deviating from an accepted norm. Okay, so socially defined norm defines how people are supposed to behave. This is everything from, um, I mean, it all of the norms, folkways, mores that one could experience about how to behave. Like we put on clothes every morning. Why do we do? Because it's the social expectation, right? Uh, if we were at a naturalist gathering, we might not wear clothes, but that's because the expected norm there is different, right? So deviance in a sociological sense means simply deviating from the social norm.
Okay, so
Okay.
it would include things, for example, like a male player choosing to play a female character in a very light, that's a very light form of deviance, presumably. Is that something
Right.
that would be
Mhm.
included?
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And mind you, that I say absolutely, but if, for example, the norm in the group is, yeah, we don't care what you play, what gender you play your character as, then that's not deviant,
Mm.
right? Um, but we're carrying with us at all times. I mean, this is why the soft community becomes important because the soft community gives the most immediate social frame for, wait, what set of norms am I paying attention to, right? But we're always simultaneously with that, all the time, carrying with us whatever our own understanding is of outside social expectations, right? Outside community. So we've got this sort of layering effect going on. What are the expectations because of these people being my friends? What are the expectations of this soft community? What are the expectations of the community outside of that? And those are not always, in accord with one another. Like, let me give you an example of this. For a very long time, if you look at the published gaming material, you'll find that most of it kind of assumes a very heterosexual and cisgender approach to gameplay. And yet, one of the things that happens when the other groups that I work with is tabletop. gamers, Gamers. Tabletop gamers as a group is all about legitimating the idea that, well, you don't have to be homosexual. You can be, any other sexual orientation. You can be not cisgender. You can be transgender or gender non-binary. And all of that is reflecting that within that group, the norm is we're okay with that. Even though you can go to another group and find out that, oh my goodness, you mean it's not okay to have a same-sex relationship as my character? It's kind of like, and I always find that very interesting that in a game that purports to be about unleashing our imaginations, that these outside expectations keep intruding, right? I think when looking at this, you have to be aware of what's going on inside someone's own understanding of themselves, but also what's going on outside.
Understood. Um, so the picture I've got, I mean, that's such a huge topic as well. So one of the things I'm researching is the reaction to the 2024 Pride image or 2025 that was released by Wizards of the Coast, which provoked in some quarters quite a strong negative reaction, and in others a positive reaction, and another meh, whatever, because it's fancy. Do what you want with fantasy, for example. Um, so if we just going back for a bit to the topic of deviance, would I be right in thinking you have downward deviance, which is where your behavior is poor according to the majority of this of society viewpoint. You have a sort of horizontal deviance where you're basically experimenting with alternates, but not really morally higher or lower or whatever it might be. But you also have potential for upward deviance where you actually try out things which are for want of a better phrase, better than what you would normally do. So you get to be a bit more have a bit more self-sacrifice, a bit more heroic, a bit more help for other people around you. And what strikes me as really interesting about these conversations about deviance is that it tends to be the horizontal and the downward movement that seems to be emphasized in TTRPGs rather than the up. Is that fair?
We're primed, we're cued to react often strongly to perceived deviance that's perceived as being somehow um, violating those norms in a negative way, right? Uh, and that's part of socialization. It's part of how we psychologically understand ourselves and our place around others, right? Uh, what's interesting about this is when you talk about sort of upward deviance, the doing something that you yourself might not do, but you're going to do it as this character that will have a powerful outcome. Um, it often, well, I want to be careful. I don't want to say often. I would say it happens in such a way that sometimes players don't know how to react to one another about it, right? That if you say abstractly, my character is going to go and fling themselves on uh, the the big bad guy or the terrible the device that's going to destroy everything, and I'm going to do this to save everyone. It's like everyone goes, that's amazing. But at the same time, you'll probably find people going, I can do that. No, my character's not doing it, right? And I would say that this exploration of what's considered possible has only grown over time. That I think that if you look at, for example, more recent forms of role playing like story games, that I think some of that comes across more strongly. I mean, the thing about and I'm not saying it doesn't happen in D&D, particularly in sort of trad as it's understood today, gaming. But it is the case that oftentimes the sort of the upward or more positively inclined deviants often gets defined either mechanically, you do this, your character gets better, or diegetically within the context of the game, it's like, oh, you get this reward, right, within the game. Uh, you get to marry the king's daughter or son, or both, or neither, whatever. But I bring that up because uh, I think we're still very much at the beginnings of understanding this stuff. I don't. I genuinely think of role playing as being under researched.
I couldn't agree more. It's also incredibly understudied, as probably evidenced by the fact that still the best book I think there is on RPGs was from 1983, based on a study conducted in 1970, 78, 79. So yeah, there's definitely space here. So thank you so far. This is really, really interesting. And the deviant, so in my experience, as I think I've put across, the deviance aspect has tended to be a downward morality. Certainly, that was the case in the Gary Allen Fine book. But if I'm understanding you correctly, the soft community is really the people around the table. And if the people around the table and their norms of what is deviant and what is not changes, then that dial might be a bit less negative and a bit more horizontal in terms of let's try alternates, and maybe a bit more north, a bit more upward in terms of let's try some good behavior. But it will ultimately depend on who you are playing with.
Absolutely.
Um, and
Yes.
therefore, as role-playing games and players evolve, and as society evolves, because obviously society feeds into what players are,
Right.
then the nature of games and the nature of deviance might change. And then what we saw 40 odd years ago, I mean, just to summarize, Gary Allen Fine was finding, pillaging, rape, murder, infanticide, all sorts of stuff. I mean, all within the context of a game. None of it is wishful thinking, obviously, on the parts of the players. But compare that to today, I think that's probably a bit less likely. It might depend a bit on system, like you seem to allude to, and what the system rewards you
Um,
for.
no, I would agree with that. I would say that I mean, so let's look at the where did role playing come from? Tabletop role playing as a hobby form emerged out of miniatures wargaming and closely associated board war games of the time. And one of the myths that I run into pretty consistently, and it annoys me, is there was this belief in some quarters that role playing happened sui generis out of D&D, and I'm just kind of like, what planet are you on? And let me explain. Everyone sort of says, well, but there wasn't really role playing that took place back with miniatures gaming and board games. I mean, they were just, abstractly fighting battles. Nothing could be further from the truth. Role playing did take place in miniatures war games and board war games all the time. People were fighting Napoleonic's battles with 15 millimeter lead Napoleonic era armies, right? They were imagining themselves, and still today are imagining themselves as Marshal Soult, Marshal Ney, Wellington, Blucher, you know, all of them, right? And they know them right down to the names of historical figures. Um, like, for example, there's I think the work that gets a certain amount of popularity for its expression of historical deviance is Die Cavalier Madchen, the Cavalry Maiden by Nadezhda Durova, who was an officer in the Tsar's army during the Napoleonic era, but she was a woman, and how did she get that way? Well, she explains as part of her memoir about how that ended up coming to be. So here's this woman acting in a deviant way in the Napoleonic era, and later on serves an example for others, like, well, yeah, look what she did, right? Okay. And so that whole role playing thing was going on, but it's in this frame of conflict. It's in this frame of war. And so violence is expected. Violence is not only expected, but also the results of violence are treated with a certain well, to borrow a phrase, a certain cavalier attitude. War happens, right? Um, and I think that because Dungeons and Dragons came so clearly out of that, that the elements of what are associated with war were considered part of the play of the game. And this also gets reinforced by the fantasy literature that also informs it. Everything from Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian to Poul Anderson's Three Hearts and Three Lions to Poul Anderson's The Broken Sword. I mean, these books are violent. Okay. And yet we see, particularly something like Three Hearts and Three Lions, that's often ongoing violence that's being perpetrated for a greater good. Here's, Holger the Dane, right? This, who is a knight. We're getting into the matter of France at this point, right? This is not so much Arthur, but so much uh, the French roman around the Knights of the Round Table. And Anderson draws on that to create this character who's trying his level best to do good, right? And one of the takeaways at the end of the story is that now he's returned, in a sense, now that he's returned to the here and now, because he's from our time put into a fantasy frame and then comes back. Another very common trope in fantasy. Um, Holger Dansk ends up finding that the real world is kind of disenchanted, that the enchantment of the fantasy world is the opportunity to do something really good. And he doesn't find that as readily. And by the way, this also ties in to what you're talking about, ties into I'm going to sort of aside to world building for a moment. When I think another place to understand this stuff would be to look at Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, and when the consolation of world building, but world building with purpose. That purpose is to realize things that may have not been present in your everyday life, right? And he's writing this as a younger man. Well, when he was writing On Fairy Stories, it comes later, but he's writing that after having the experience of being an officer in the British Army who gets wounded on the Western Front, and fortunately returns home. Uh, and there's been some scholarship that's been done since then about the whole effect of the First World War on Tolkien's imagining of what he was trying to express in The Lord of the Rings. But in on fairy stories, what you're getting is very much the sense of, well, here's the secondary reality. What are we trying to do there? But that's world building. But it, in its own way, indirectly influences a lot of fantasy writers who then write things that gamers read and think of as being really cool. And that's how we want to play our game, right? And so Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, when they get around to writing the Dragonlance stories, you know, for they're extraordinarily popular, but they were extraordinarily popular when they were written, largely because they were pastiches. I don't mean that meanly, but very much as pastiches of fantasy that had been written before, right? And that fantasy ended up being, literally what gamers were saying was, yeah, we'd like some more of that, please. Give us more of that. So I know I've kind of gone off on a tangent here, but I hope it's not wrong.
There's,
I hope you find it worthwhile.
no, there's nothing uninteresting. I was just thinking how I read Dragonlance before I read Tolkien. And it's a very easy introduction to
Yeah,
Tolkien-esque fantasy actually. But then I did it the wrong way around. So
right.
it was harder for me to see where things had been lifted. Um, so in the modern world and what you do these days, um, and in terms of how people play RPGs these days, um, can RPGs be a force for good? rather than just experimenting with poor behavior, in your view?
Well, and that's where the what you call the sort of upward forms of deviance become actually really important. Okay, and again, that's where that which frame are you referring to when you're trying to understand what what are you doing? Like um, Monster Hearts, for example, often gets held up as a story game that helps particularly, uh, like for example, uh, LGBTQIA plus young people to understand themselves and each other and how to deal with the society around them that does not view them positively, right? So, can RPGs be a force for good? Absolutely. Um, they are often, in fact, one of the things that I find, and this is why I bring up the LGBTQIA plus context for this, is that role playing games are one of the first places where people who are trying to understand their sexuality and their gender identity, it's one of the first places where they actually go and say, I can be who I am, right? But I'm just playing character, right? And it's also the case that, for example, uh, you have opportunities for example, people of color, which is, my background. I'm Native American. Okay, I'm a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. I'm a Dakota. Okay, my family's originally from South Central South Dakota, but my mom's white. Her background ethnically was English, Scottish a little bit, um, and you know, this is where we get to play around with things that help us value ourselves. And so, yeah, I mean, role playing games are a place where this can all happen. And yet, I mean, it's let me give you an example of that. I have thought for a while. One of the games that I enjoy thematically is Space 1889. Okay, which came out 30, 40 years ago, 40 years ago, 40 years ago, let's call a spade a spade, 40 years ago, um, which presents, Frank Chadwick wrote it for a game designers workshop, and it presents the sun never sets on the British Empire across at least 3 planets in the solar system, right? This is a very steampunk, actually very early steampunk stuff going on. But the way that it's presented in the game is you're supposed to play one of the people who's um, part of the colonizers, right? Everything from, German Zeppelin pilots on Venus to British colonial officers in Her Majesty's recent acquisitions in the highlands of Mars, right? And at the time, for wargamers, it's like, well, of course we do that. That's just what you do. But what I wanted to do was to take Space 1889 and say, okay, let's stand this on its head. All the player characters are going to be revolutionaries of one sort or another, right? Fenians, uh, members of Narodnaya Volia from Russia, or maybe Martians who are not happy that the Union Jack flies overhead. Okay, and I wanted to do that because you could make the game about, so what is it like to resist colonization in a world where it's taken for granted, and you could do it in this whole fictive way, which can be kind of interesting. Never had a chance to work that one out. I've seen similar sorts of work. There was a trilogy of what are now considered probably some of the best adventures for classic traveler, the Sky Raiders series. Okay, Legend of the Sky Raiders, Trail of the Sky Raiders, whatever the last one was, I think Fate of the Sky Raiders or something like that. And It was written for Classic Traveler, and it draws very strongly on things like the African Queen and Heart of Darkness. And you're on this planet. There's primitive natives, and you're trying to find these ancient artifacts. Indiana Jones in space. Okay, it's great. And I have to go back and look and find it again. But somebody wrote this absolutely masterful critique of the colonialism in Legend of the Skyraiders and how to upset that by recasting the game and giving the natives of this one planet, aliens, more agency in terms of their interaction with the storyline and with what was being attempted as part of the adventure. So, what is the adventure about? Well, it's on one level recovering this artifact. On another level, it's also like, hey, wait a second, what's really going on here with these people, and are we doing the right thing? Right? And those things are part of what makes this really important. That role playing games give us the opportunity not just to play what the author intended, but we can turn them and use them in ways that make a difference for us in whole new creative and imaginative forms. And that's, I think, part of the value of role playing itself is that issue. Okay, is that we get to make something new out of something that was created for us. And good examples of that are ones that we end up having the opportunity to create something memorable out of. I don't want to pass judgment on whether or not the art itself is good, as it is, but I do think that it is the value of role playing is not just in whatever's on the printed page, but in our interactions with each other